So, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me. Okay, so now for something completely different. We've had pretty interesting conversations throughout the day about the technical dimensions of e-waste, and we just heard a really fascinating conversation about the business dimensions. I'm a social scientist by training. I sit in a school of public policy, and I also direct the science, technology, and public policy program on campus, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of the direction that I'm coming from, but hopefully in the few minutes that I have today, I'll give you a further perspective. And I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is that I see my participation in this overall initiative as being really at the beginning. So you'll find that in my presentation, I have more questions than answers. Hopefully they're informed questions. They're questions that have been informed by the time that I spent in Chile last summer, and as well as doing research back here in Ann Arbor. But I want to sort of give you a sense of that perspective as well, so that as you all and as we think together about e-waste, that perhaps this perspective will be seen as an integral one. And I should say my own background itself is quite interdisciplinary, and you'll see that kind of my intervention, I think, is pretty interdisciplinary as well. So my field, actually, I said I'm a social scientist. My field is actually something called science and technology studies, which gives you a sense that it itself is quite interdisciplinary. I study I do social science of science, technology, and medicine. And a central component, a central concept in that field is the idea that technologies are not independent objects. Right? We tend to think of technologies as objective, as driven primarily or solely by technical specifications, and perhaps secondarily, as came up earlier, by economic specifications, like questions of efficiency. But scholars in my field, and that includes myself, have demonstrated in a variety of ways that technologies, first of all, technologies themselves are actually socio-technical systems, that humans are an integral part of technological systems, but so too are laws, policies, social networks, stakeholder networks, et cetera, and that we actually are better off if we understand technologies and technology policies, which are ultimately the kinds of things that I'm the most interested in, if we see technologies as deeply embedded in historical, social, and political context, in addition to economic context. And so I, as a scholar, as a researcher, do comparative research, and so a project that has been looking at Chile, Ghana, and Thailand is something that I'm particularly interested in, because I think comparatively in those terms. So when I say that they're socio-technical systems, let me give you a couple of examples. Perhaps the most iconic example in my field is the example of the bridge built by Robert Moses in Long Island, a bridge that seems in and of itself to be simply a piece of architecture, of urban planning, of a highway. It's a technology, but the bridge was built in a way that it was so low that buses from New York City could not get to the beaches of Long Island. And what did that mean? That meant that those that were living in the inner cities in New York, primarily African Americans, could not get to the beaches of Long Island. So embedded in that technology, there were particular values and particular attitudes around race. It's another way of thinking, for example, about structural bias. So that's one iconic example. It's an example that the scholar Langdon Winner has used to argue that technologies are political artifacts, that technologies are deeply political. In my own work, my first book was about genetic testing, and I demonstrated how a technology that seems pretty straightforward, genetic testing for breast cancer, even the way that DNA analysis is done in two very similar countries, the US and Britain, are completely different. And I argue in the book that that's a result of different traditions of commercialization, different ideas about social healthcare, the responsibility of society and government in healthcare, and those things are embedded in the details of the technology themselves, right? That's the key point. They're then tied to policies, to political cultures, to ideologies, and to histories. And that's the basic point from which my own work comes. And it means that I then, I mean, this is a new term, I just came up with it for this talk, but who knows, maybe I'll publish something about it, is that, maybe we shouldn't just be talking really about sociotechnical systems, that what I'm really talking about is politico-sociotechnical systems. So let's get down to the e-waste question, right? But I've been talking sort of at a broad level around technology. So what does this mean for e-waste? Of course, we're talking about e-waste, but technologies are central to e-waste, right? Refrigerators, TVs, we've been talking about a number of technologies today, and those technologies, if we take this perspective, would be embedded in these kinds of social, political, historical, and economic networks. But so too, I would argue, are our systems for disposing of these technologies. Those too are embedded deeply, fundamentally in these particular contexts. And we're all gathered here because we're particularly concerned about the potential problems that e-waste raises and developing solutions. So then what does this kind of perspective mean for developing those kinds of interventions? I think it means a few things. The first is that whether we like it or not, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, right? When we're talking about 3 incredibly different countries and many, many more, that we have to take that seriously. If technologies and forms of technology, disposing of those technologies are in fact embedded in context, then we can't actually find singular interventions that are likely to work across contexts. The second thing that I think we want to draw from this perspective is that the current practices work, okay? What does that mean? That means that if it's embedded in a particular context, those practices evolved in those contexts because they work for somebody, for particular systems, for particular social structures, for particular policymakers, et cetera. And we need to understand why that works if we want to in some way intervene or undo it in some way. And this is a perennial issue when we're talking about the relationship between technology and development. The history of international development is littered with technologies that have had mixed to negative effects, in part, I would argue, because this relationship hasn't been taken seriously enough. So, from that perspective, I want to talk a little bit about my more specific findings. And as I said, they're tentative. They're more questions than answers. But I used some of the data that people have talked about all day, some of the survey data that was discussed earlier. We also did more open-ended interviews with e-waste recyclers, with stakeholders and policymakers that I think Gloria and Uka are going to talk more about. My studies tend to be multiple years in scope, and they tend to involve ethnography, over 100 interviews, historical and document analysis. So this is a really short and quick analysis. Hopefully these are the kinds of things we might do in the future. So Pablo already talked a little bit about the Chilean context, and I'm not Chilean, obviously, so I'm not going to belabor this, but I only want to bring this up again briefly because I want to tie this then to the kinds of tentative findings that we've seen. So Pablo talked this morning about the Pinochet dictatorship and the idea that sort of this new form of democracy is really a post-1990 phenomenon. And what that means is still really evolving. I don't know if Gloria is going to talk about it. We've certainly had many conversations about the dynamics of this in the Chilean context. But the way we tend to think about advocacy and interest group involvement in policy development in the United States is very different in the Chilean context, and I think that that's something that's important to note here, and I'll get to why in a second. The second point, again, so in some ways, the fact that Pablo said this morning was good, because I was like, okay, I got it right. The second major point, I hit the 3 major points that Pablo talked about this morning, right? So the second is that Chile is essentially the first location for the neoliberal experiment outside of the United States. It was a hotbed. It was the place that University of Chicago, I should say, my alma mater, went to figure out whether or not this neoliberal experiment, that is widespread privatization of industry, would really work. And then finally, Chile is one of South America's most prosperous countries, but it's also quite unequal. And that's important to keep in mind, and I think very relevant to thinking about the questions around the formal and informal economy that we've been discussing all day today. A couple of things that are particularly relevant to this case is that it joined the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's come up earlier today in 2010, and that is classified by the World Bank as a high-income economy. So what does this, this is the political history. You see some flavors of political culture and ideology in this really potted story. What are the implications then? What does this have to do with e-waste? So I want to suggest a couple of things from the tentative findings that we've developed. The first is in terms of the policy apparatus that has emerged. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because I think that that's what Gloria and Uka are going to focus on. But the first is that Chile adopted an extended producer responsibility law that was essentially developed by the OECD and implemented in the United States and in Europe. Right? So Chile was, in fact, the first place outside of the US and Europe to adopt this law, and it looked largely the same, except for one thing, which is that it included attention to informal recyclers as a result of activism from a particularly charismatic individual, again, someone that I suspect Gloria and Uka may talk about. And that shows how the policy itself sort of gets tweaked to represent local realities, but it also gives you a sense of how we sort of tend to think about these things as kind of cookie cutters, but even in this context, it gets shaped a little bit, right? So the second set of questions is how does this then shape, how does this overall political culture shape e-waste repair and recycling practices in the country? So the first is, and this is something, again, that we've talked about already today, is that there seems to be more formality, particularly in comparison to Ghana and Thailand. That might have to do with its status as a higher income country, but also the gradations of inequality. So you have, sort of people at different levels in the economic spectrum working at different levels of formality and informality. You have a standalone company, as Rick mentioned this morning, to recycling within homes. We also saw a pretty strong repair and secondhand sale economy outside of Santiago in Temuco, and I wonder whether we're more likely to see that in poorer areas because there might be more of a market for secondhand sale. So what does that mean for the way that we think about e-waste? The second thing that I thought was extremely interesting, and this is actually something that bears, I think, some attention because it hasn't really come up today, and this came up in our open-ended interviews with e-waste recyclers and repairers, is the level of government distrust, especially in this new REP law. So there were a number of people, especially those people who were in Temuco, who basically said, we don't really believe that this new legislation is going to represent us. We don't know this activist. We've heard of him. We don't know him very well. We're not entirely sure that he represents our needs. And we don't have any other kind of representation in this system. So their needs are not necessarily being reflected in the way that we might tend to think that it is by this kind of change to the law. And the second point that's related, and this is really something that I want to emphasize, is why it is that these individuals are engaged in these practices. The conversation today, I think, has suggested implicitly that e-waste recyclers are doing this work because they have no other choice. But one of the alternative perspectives is that these recyclers are engaged in this work because it provides them with a certain kind of autonomy that they cannot get in the formal economy. And that's something that you see in other places when we're talking about people who work in the informal economy. And I think that we would be remiss in any kind of intervention we developed or any kind of formalization effort we developed if we ignored that. I don't have much time left, so I'm going to speed through a couple of things. The first thing is that I also want to note that these are often that the people who are engaged in these practices are often part of kinship networks who are engaged in these practices. So these are dense networks, so it suggests that those are potential places for influence in terms of how we think about engaging in or producing new kinds of interventions. So I want to spend, I know I don't have much time, but I'm going to take a minute and just talk about, I said I had a lot of questions, right? And I think that there are at least a couple that I want to emphasize for this conversation because I don't think that they've come up yet today. And I think, again, when we're talking about engaging in interventions, especially in outside of the United States and outside of the United States and Europe, we have to think very seriously about. This gets at the broader point around the role of academics in engaging in the world. And the first is, for whom exactly is e-waste a problem, and what kind of problem is it? What does social benefit look like to us, and does that actually look the same to people who are engaging in this work? And in relation to this, we have to acknowledge, I think, that these individuals who are engaged in this work have significant knowledge and expertise that we don't necessarily value to the degree that we should. In reflection of the diversity and inclusivity conversation that we had this morning, it's not just about, sort of our values and producing politically legitimate policies. It's also about recognizing that we might actually produce better interventions if we take this kind of knowledge and expertise seriously, that we might consider that this kind of expertise might differ between urban and rural areas, between richer and poorer areas, between the center and the periphery, for example, in the Chilean context. And these are the kinds of things that we need to think about. And then finally, when we think about it comparatively, as I said, I'm interested in these questions from a comparative perspective. We have to think about the fact that we need to do deep analysis of what the details of these kinds of Politico sociotechnical systems look like in individual countries, but then look comparatively seriously at the differences and understand the roles that history, political culture, and ideology play. That may produce, in fact, I'm sure it will produce uncomfortable realities for those of us who want to have relatively simple and portable solutions. But I think that if we want to actually produce solutions that are successful, these are the kinds of questions that we need to take seriously and engage in some detailed research on. So I'll stop there.